content. As you said, very few fresh fruit and vegetables. But what is just so tragic is that as members of Congress, we don't live on this budget each and every day. There's an end in sight for us. But for millions of Americans, there is no end in sight. This is their existence. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that that is no more, and that people have the right to eat healthy, nutritious foods without worrying about health consequences, without worrying about now the $20 billion, which will cut substantially their ability to buy even the kinds of foods that are unhealthy. So thank you very much for being here with us. Let me now yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts who serves on the Ag Committee, chairs our Hunger Caucus, and has been a tremendous, consistent champion on behalf of those who are hungry, not only here but throughout the world, but also fights for food security. And I just want to thank him for being with us tonight, and thank you for your leadership. Congressman McGovern has also taken the food stamp challenge many, many, many times and has really helped organize all of us here to be very focused on what is the real deal as it relates to the least of these. Thank you again.
Well, thank you. I want to thank my distinguished colleague from California for organizing this and for her leadership on this and so many other issues aimed at trying to eliminate poverty in this country. And I want to thank all my colleagues who have already spoken on this issue. But I want to come to the floor just to remind people that hunger is a real problem in the United States of America. We have close to 50 million of our fellow citizens who are hungry. 17 million are kids. We're the richest, most prosperous nation in the world, and we have close to 50 million people in this country who are hungry. I'm ashamed of that fact. We all should be ashamed of that fact. And what is particularly maddening about this issue is that it is solvable. This is a solvable problem. Hunger is a political condition. We have the food, we have the resources, we have the infrastructure, we have everything but the political will to end it. And hunger is a problem that costs us dearly. You know, people say to me, oh, we can't spend any more money, we have a tough budget situation. I remind them we can't afford not to. The cost of hunger in this country is astronomical. We pay an incredible amount in terms of avoidable health care costs. People who don't eat on a regular basis, their immune systems are compromised, they end up spending more time in a hospital. Senior citizens who can't afford their prescription drugs and their food, take their prescription drugs on an empty stomach, end up in hospitals. There's a cost to that. There's a human cost and there's a financial cost to it. Children who are hungry, who go to school, don't learn. Workers who are hungry, who go to work, lack in productivity. I mean, we pay for this. We pay for this, and it is solvable. It is solvable. Now, I have come to this floor every week for the last 13 weeks with this sign, End Hunger Now. And I have given a speech every week about what we need to do to end hunger, a different perspective on hunger. I have tried to raise awareness on this issue because there is not a single community in the United States of America, not a single congressional district that is hunger-free. And one of the tools that we have to combat hunger is the SNAP program. It is not the answer to everything. It is not a perfect program, but it is one of the tools that we utilize to help alleviate hunger in this country. And we are now considering a farm bill next week, which quite extraordinary, which it's stunning to me, that rather than being a bill that helps expand opportunities for our farmers and helps alleviate hunger, will be a farm bill that makes hunger worse. The House of Representatives is going to consider a bill that came out of the House Agriculture Committee that cuts SNAP by $20.5 billion. $20.5 billion. 2 million people will lose their benefit. Hundreds of thousands of kids who qualify right now for free breakfast and lunch at school because their parents are on SNAP will lose that benefit. And I've had people say to me, well, you know, those people ought to go out and look for a job. The fact of the matter is that millions and millions and millions of people who are on SNAP right now work. They work full-time. But they earn so little they still qualify for this benefit. We ought to have a debate in this Congress about ensuring that work pays a livable wage, that when people go to work, you know, and they work full-time, they ought not have to live in poverty. But that, unfortunately, is not the reality as we speak. The reality is that there are millions of people who are working who earn so little that they need this benefit to feed their kids, to feed their families. And as we emerge from this difficult economic crisis, we need to make sure that this safety net is in place. We need to ensure that people have enough to eat. That shouldn't be a controversial issue. And to my Republican friends, I would say, you know, this used to be a bipartisan issue. I mean, the great, you know, anti-hunger programs that our country has, you know, emerged as a result of bipartisan cooperation. In the 1970s, Senator Bob Dole of Kansas and Senator George McGovern of South Dakota worked together to help strengthen these programs to the point that in the 1970s we almost eliminated hunger in America. We made progress. We came close. Then we undid all of this. We turned our backs on those who were struggling, and now we have close to 50 million people who are hungry in this country. That, to me, is a national scandal. And rather than putting forward a farm bill that makes hunger worse, we ought to be talking about a farm bill that helps solve this problem. I've urged the White House to call a conference or a summit on food and nutrition to bring us all together, all the various agencies that have some role in combating hunger, the charities, the food banks, the churches, the synagogues, the mosques, the doctors, the teachers, the nutritionists, the people who are involved in this issue one way or another. Let's bring us all together and actually come up with a plan to end this scourge. And we can do this. And we can do this. You know, you're not going to solve a problem without a plan, and we do not have a plan. But as we wait to develop that plan, let's not take away what is there right now to help keep people from being hungry to literally starving. I mean, when you cut a program like this by $20 billion, and by the way, a program with one of the lowest error rates of any federal program that we have. I wish I could find a missile program that the Pentagon has championed that has a lower error rate than the SNAP program. It would be phenomenal, quite frankly. We would save billions of dollars if the Pentagon ran their missile programs as efficiently as this program is run. And yet it has been demonized. It has been diminished. People have demagogued this program. And all it does is provide people the ability to buy food. That's all it does. And the fact that we would be taking away this safety net at this difficult time is something I don't think we should do. And to my Democratic colleagues who are saying, you know, we ought to support a farm bill even though it's got $20 billion of cuts in it and, you know, we'll send it to conference and hopefully it will all get better. Don't do that. Don't do that. I mean, our party, if it stands for anything, we have stood by and for those who are poor, those who are struggling, those who are vulnerable. Let's not throw that away. Let's not trash our principles. You know, this is not the bill that should be moving forward, not a bill that makes hunger worse. And I want to also call attention to the fact that I joined with Congresswoman Lee and others in taking the food stamp challenge today, and I just want to remind you that this SNAP challenge that we took today means that we live on an average SNAP benefit, which is $1.50 a meal, you know, and it is $4.50 a day. I mean, how much does a Starbucks coffee cost? I mean, this is what people live on, and I hear people, my critics will say, well, this is meant as a supplement, you know, not to be the entire food budget. Well, I'm going to tell you something. Things are tough for a lot of people. This is their entire food budget. In fact, what they do is they utilize this modest benefit, and then they go to food banks, and they go to their churches, and they go to their charities and look for additional food because this doesn't provide enough. And so those of us in Congress who are trying to call attention to the fact that this is an important program, and by the way, it is not an overly generous program. We're doing this SNAP challenge. Some say, well, this is a gimmick, it's a stunt. Well, you know what? We're trying to call attention to a real problem in this country, and if you think it's a gimmick or a stunt, you take the challenge. You live on this for a week. You see how difficult it is. It's hard to be poor. It takes a lot of time to try to make ends meet, to try to put a grocery list together that will get you through the week. And we're doing it just for ourselves. Imagine doing it when you have kids. I'm the parent of a 50-year-old boy and an 11-year-old girl. I couldn't imagine the anguish of wondering whether or not I could put food on the table to make sure they had enough to eat. This is the United States of America. We should be trying to lift people up, not put people down. Let me just say finally, none of us here believe that this should be a permanent condition. In fact, what we need to do is have a conversation about how to extend these ladders of opportunity for people so they can climb out of poverty, so they won't need this, so they can be on their own, so they can have a job. And that's why so many of us have been complaining about the fact that we have a lot of debates here on the floor and a lot of bills, but we don't seem to have many bills that deal with job creation. That's the answer. That's the answer. You want to get people off of SNAP? Give them a job that pays a livable wage. That pays a livable wage. I'll just say in conclusion that I appreciate the opportunity to be able to highlight this issue. I'll tell you, I have spent an awful lot of time as co-chair of the House Hunger Caucus meeting with people who are struggling in this country and meeting with families who have kids who are hungry. You meet a child who is hungry, it breaks your heart. You can't get it out of your mind. And that there are hungry children in this country is something that should not be. And so I would urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, let's come together and reject these cuts in the Farm Bill, reject these cuts in SNAP, and let's try to figure out a way to restore those monies so that people will not go without. And then let's have a Farm Bill we can be proud of. If we cannot reverse the $20.5 billion in cuts in SNAP, then there's no way we should support that Farm Bill. There's no way. Republicans and Democrats should join together and say no. We're not going to support a Farm Bill that makes hunger worse. And so I appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to working with the gentlelady from California and others in trying to find ways to make sure people in this country have enough to eat, but also make sure we develop a plan to help people transition off of this assistance so they can be independent and productive like all the people we know who are struggling want to be. So I thank the gentlelady, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for that very powerful and clear presentation, but also for what you do each and every day for the last 13 years. This is part of your life's work. And so thank you very much for not only talking about why we need to not cut the $20 billion, but also why we need to build these ladders of opportunity so that people can get a good paying job and lift themselves out of poverty. Congressman McGovern mentioned the food stamp challenge that many of us are taking. Congressman Johnson also, our Congressional Black Caucus Chair Marcia Fudge, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, our Democratic Caucus Vice Chair, Mr. Crowley, and approximately 25 members will be taking part in this food stamp challenge, in addition to who will speak next, our Congresswoman from the District of Columbia, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, because we need to raise the level of awareness of what is taking place here, not only here in Washington, D.C., in this body, but in the District of Columbia, where we all have to thank Congresswoman Norton, who is our representative during the week. And we need to make sure that we recommit ourselves to fighting hunger, fighting poverty, and to not voting for this this ag bill if the $20 billion cut it remains. So, Congresswoman Norton, thank you so much. Thank you for allowing us to be at your grocery stores today and to work with people in your district to really see and understand exactly what's going on here in the District of Columbia.
Well, I thank the gentlelady from California for her consistent, heartfelt, energetic leadership on this issue for so many years, and I see the gentleman from Georgia is here. I'm so pleased that he brought down his stash for the week. I had to ask him, did you really get those bananas? And he budgeted so well that he was able to stay within the $31.50 for the week. Now, we've done this before, and I can tell you it's not pleasant if you're really adhering to this budget, but we had an effect before. When members joined together and took the challenge, we were able not only to keep the cuts from occurring, but to raise the level for those on food stamps. I was interested to hear the gentleman from Massachusetts talk about the low error rate, something like 3%. I just sat through a committee hearing this morning, and the discussion was about how much waste and fraud there was in reported in a 2011 report from Afghanistan, from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they reported that about 30% was attributed to waste and fraud. And here we have poor people in a program with the lowest error rate I've seen in a long time. And I want to thank all of the members who visited at our, what I will call our neighborhood Capitol Hill Safeway at 14th and D Street Southeast, where we had the help of employees and who helped guide us toward the least expensive food. What we're talking about here is the House outdoing the Senate. Now, the Senate bill already cuts $4 billion. The House wants to up that 5 times. How much damage can we do and sit up straight and feel that we are worthy to be in the Congress of the United States? We succeeded because of the stimulus in raising the amount from $1.40 per day. It's an amazing number, to $4.50 a day. You know, when I was going down the aisle, one of the clerks said to me, well, don't you want to get some water? I said, God, go to the spigot, please. Don't buy water. I hope people are not buying water on the food stamp challenge, because you'll have to eat it. Water is very expensive. We're talking about, we believe that at least 20 million children will be affected, and 10 million of them are labeled in deep poverty. Now, these people are going to be off the rolls altogether. The reason they're on it at all is because in our wisdom, food stamps, SNAP, has become an entitlement. There's some on the other side that want to take that away from them. I don't know where people would be. TANF, for example, its rolls have not increased. So what people have at least been able to do is to eat. And let me tell you about eating. The calculation is that this amount will last you about 2.5 weeks. If you're eating anywhere near what you should be on $4.50 a day, it's going to last you, according to all the statistics, 2.5 weeks. What do you think people do the rest of the month on a month's worth of food stamps that last 2.5 weeks? They go to the pantries. They go and get the rest of what they need handed to them in the pantries, which is why the pantries cupboards are bare. You go there and they're begging for food to come because so many people are coming to the pantries, because food stamps cannot sustain a family. These are the poorest of our people. So all we're trying to do is just try to raise the consciousness really right here in the House of Representatives. If we got even where the Senate was, that would mean hundreds of thousands of people off of food stamps that have no other sustenance. And you know, it's as if people sometimes say, well, what more can we do to to people on food stamps. It seems to me the person who has found, who's hit the bottom, and that's something that's in the Senate bill that keeps the ban certain ex-convicts from receiving food stamps for life. Now, wait a minute. I understand. And then they list certain kinds of violent crimes and so forth, and it's very easy to get everybody worked up about giving them any food. I mean, if this is what you want to do to them, why don't you just give them a life sentence and leave them in jail where they'll be fed 3 meals a day? But this means that if you committed one of these crimes, and they do mean only murderers, rapists, and pedophiles, so these are not people for whom anybody will speak up. If you've committed one of those crimes, even if it was a single crime, even if it was decades ago, even if you've been doing well, except if you committed one of those crimes, you're not doing well perhaps so that you do not need food stamps. Not only you would not have food stamps, but the family allotment would be decreased by you. What are we trying to do? By the way, don't they say they have a lot of Christians on the other side of the aisle, Christian conservatives? Where are they? Where are they? Aren't those the people that Jesus would have reached out to and said, let me feed you? Because nobody else will. I just don't think that when you hit people when they're down as low as they can get, you ought to be proud of yourselves as a Congress. We even find among low-income workers, if I could just make one point, most of them try to keep from getting on food stamps. And you have some states going out and saying, you know what, I think instead of going hungry, you might want to, and depending entirely, these are low-income people who work on the pantries, I think you're entitled to SNAP. We had people in the streets here in the District of Columbia just last month who work in these iconic buildings, federal buildings, for retail. And they work for, some of these are great big retailers, like your fast food people. Pay them the minimum wage with no benefits. Guess who pays? Those who, in fact, have knowledge come and supplement these low incomes with food stamps. And guess where they get their health care from? You and me, the taxpayers. Why are we allowing people to pay people so little that they depend upon the taxpayers to make up the rest? So, my good friend from California, I say to you, thank you for taking your usual leadership here, and particularly your leadership on the SNAP challenge. Don't feel sorry for us. We'll have plenty to eat before and after. It doesn't begin, I think, until the 13th for a week. We ask only that you think deeply about those who we will represent on this SNAP challenge, and I yield and thank the gentlelady from California.
Thank you. Let me thank the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, first of all, for working day and night on behalf of the residents of the District of Columbia. Secondly, for really laying out additional impacts and how this $20 billion cut and what the bill will actually do in a very negative way. I mean, all of the issues that you raised, many people don't even know are in the bills. And so that's why we try to beat the drum a little bit down here on the floor. And you certainly have awakened America in terms of what some of the really critical issues are in this bill. So thank you again for your leadership and your friendship. Let me just, how many minutes do I have left, Mr. Speaker?
Gentlelady has 3 minutes.
Okay, let me just conclude before I yield a minute to the gentleman from Georgia. Now, I am a former food stamp recipient myself. Of course, I'm not proud of that, but I am. I didn't talk about it for a long time because of the stigma associated with being on public assistance and on food stamps. But I decided a couple of years ago, when we started to see these tremendous cuts and assaults on these safety net programs, to really talk about my personal experience. Now, I would not, and I was going to college, raising 2 small little boys who are phenomenal young men now, raising their own families, but it was very difficult. Very difficult. I would not be here if it were not for the lifeline that the American people extended to me when I was a single mother, struggling to care for my kids. No one wants to be on food stamps. I did not want to be on food stamps. Everyone wants a job. Everyone wants to take care of their kids and their family, but there are bumps in the road sometimes, and the economy hasn't turned around for a lot of people. And so that bridge over troubled waters, that needs to be there. You know, that needs to be there. And so I hope that Democrats and Republicans reject these cuts. We need to stop sequestration. We need to start creating jobs and build these ladders of opportunity for people. And I hope, and many of us hope, that the President will veto this bill if it gets off this floor with this $20 billion cut, because, first of all, it's morally wrong, it's fiscally irresponsible, it will hurt our economy, and we need to lift people, build these ladders of opportunity, and lift the economy for all. Let me now yield to the gentleman from Georgia for a concluding statement.
Thank you, Barbara Lee. Thank you, Eleanor Holmes Norton, for what you bring to the table to this Congress. And on behalf of your constituents, one of whom is me during the week, but I'm a D.C. resident, I'm a D.C. native. I had to move to Georgia before I could come to Congress. And so, but anyway, Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the Safe Climate Caucus and as a member of the Armed Services Committee, I'd like to take a moment to discuss two major implications of climate change for the Department of Defense. First, climate change will shape the operating environment, roles, and missions that the department undertakes. It may have significant geopolitical impacts around the world, contributing to greater competition for more limited and critical life-sustaining resources like food and water. While the effects of climate change alone do not cause conflict, they may act as accelerants of instability or conflict in parts of the world. Second, the department will need to adjust to the impacts of climate change on its facilities and infrastructure. And with that, and after pointing out that we're spending $3 billion on a East Coast missile defense system, which is totally unnecessary, $3 billion I will yield
time has
back.
expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Time has expired.
It's expired now. Snap works. Thank you.
Thank you. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, tonight's discussion is not about politics. It's not about partisanship. It's about principle. It's about an American ideal, an ideal so common, so ordinary, that we don't think about it very much. Yet this ideal is essential to a well-functioning, orderly, and just society. In fact, it should define the nature of the relationship between the government and her people. Mr. Speaker, when a person uses right reason and sound judgment, when they believe something is right or wrong, that is a sacred space. That is called conscience. Conscience is inextricably intertwined with the inherent rights and dignity of all persons. It is therefore only just that governing authority have the highest level of sensitivity to upholding and protecting the person's free exercise of deeply held, reasoned beliefs. Mr. Speaker, I want to read two emails that I received from constituents back home. Katie from Nebraska says this to me. She says, quote, "Please do everything in your power to ensure that our hospitals, service agencies, and universities are allowed to carry out their work unhindered by laws that go against their conscience. I do not want to see good agencies and businesses shut down because they were forced to choose between the law and their conscience." Karen McGivney-Lechtel, she wrote to me and said this, "As a woman's health practitioner and as a Catholic, I need the ability to stay within my faith boundaries. I would be unable to work if I was required to provide the services this HHS mandate has imposed." Now, Mr. Speaker, what are they talking about? What are they referring to? Let's take a few moments and unpack the issue here. Let's review the multiple layers. The Department of Health and Human Services proposed a rule commonly known as the HHS mandate, which will take a full effect this coming August. This mandate, authorized by the 2010 health care law known as Obamacare, would require all health care plans to cover in full and consequently every American to subsidize procedures and drugs that many Americans consider to be ethically divisive. Americans who cannot in good conscience comply with this mandate will now be subject to ruinous fines if they do not obey, simply for exercising their First Amendment rights, exercising their religious freedom, exercising the deeper philosophical principle of the rights of conscience as rightly exercised by reasonable persons, doing what they believe to be right, what they believe to be good, what they believe to be just. Mr. Speaker, I simply find it difficult to understand how we can let this happen, how we got to this place in our country, how we can willfully cross a threshold that Republicans and Democrats of an earlier, wiser era sought scrupulously to avoid. For the first time in our history, Mr. Speaker, the new health care law provides the Secretary of Health and Human Services the discretionary authority to mandate the coverage of drugs and procedures such as abortion-producing drugs. Many Americans reasonably find these drugs and procedures controversial. In the past times, they were considered to be electives. If a person or an organization didn't want to choose them, they didn't have to. In 1993, Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a federal law signed into law by President Clinton. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act ensures that federal officials cannot reach into the private sphere to substantially burden the practice of religion. In view of the many philosophical and diverse religious perspectives in our country that all contribute to our vibrant civic culture, members of both parties, Mr. Speaker, worked to pass that important piece of legislation. Now, however, we have the HHS mandate, which is clearly an affront to established law and precedent. Conscience protections in health care have always been championed by members of both parties. Since Senator Frank Church authored the widely popular Church Amendment in 1973 to protect objections in conscience to abortions and sterilization. So, Mr. Speaker, what has changed? What has so dramatically changed in this body? We have lost our collective sense of respect for divergent views. We have lost our sense that the government must protect that sacred right of conscience and not coerce her citizens into doing something that they fundamentally believe is unjust or wrong. While the HHS mandate is arguably a small component of the 2010 health care law, it does bring us face to face with a stark new reality here in Washington that we fervently hope will not become the new normal in America. We have recently heard of the discrimination against Americans by certain employees at the IRS. IRS employees targeting Americans because of their religious or philosophical or political leanings. The IRS is the very agency set to implement the new health care law. Mr. Speaker, a good government must ensure that those in position of authority are committed to two principles: fairness and impartiality. These revelations about religious and political targeting have done much to undermine the public trust. But, Mr. Speaker, the HHS mandate is also a form of discrimination. It primarily targets people in faith communities, the very people who have been the backstop of compassionate care for the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalized in our society today. When the new health care law was under consideration, it was said that if you like your health care, you can keep it. Now, however, we are finding out that you may not be able to keep your health care plan. You may not be able to keep your doctor. You may not even be able to keep your own faith traditions, given this governmental threat. Mr. Speaker, no American should be forced to choose between their conscience and their livelihood. No American should be forced to choose between their faith and their job. No American should be forced to choose between their deeply held, reasoned beliefs and the law. That's a false choice. It's un-American and is wrong. Now, I want to thank my colleagues who have joined me tonight to share other stories of Americans who are deeply concerned about the impact of this mandate upon them, but who also, I think, are going to discuss the very purpose of our government, which at its core should be to protect the dignity and the rights of every person, beginning with the fundamental right of the reasonable exercise of conscience. Mr. Speaker, this is not some theoretical debate. This is about the preservation of our way of life, the ability to work as we choose, the ability to serve as we see fit, with what should be support from our government. With that said, I'd like to now call upon and yield time to my good friend Joe Pitts, who heads the Values Action Team, who has been a stalwart leader for years upon years now for basic protections for the most vulnerable and the calling forth of leadership in the whole arena of human rights. Joe Pitts is from Pennsylvania. He was a Vietnam War veteran. He flew 116 combat missions in service to our country. Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, for his outstanding leadership on this issue that we're discussing tonight, the right of conscience. And I come tonight to the floor with alarm over how this administration is trampling on our First Amendment rights. Freedom of assembly means that Americans can come together to petition the government. But the IRS has targeted conservative groups for extra scrutiny, throwing up roadblocks to their organization. Freedom of the press means that journalists can work on stories without government interference. But the Justice Department subpoenaed multiple telephone numbers for the Associated Press and investigated a Fox News journalist as a co-conspirator. Freedom of religion means that the government does not get to tell you to violate your beliefs. But Obamacare is forcing even explicitly religious employers to provide services they have moral objections to. Our freedoms are clearly under assault by government bureaucrats who claim that they know what is best for all Americans. Over 60 organizations around the country, nonprofits and businesses, are suing the federal government to protect their rights. One of those businesses is located in my district in Lancaster County, Conestoga Wood Specialties of East Earle, Pennsylvania, and for nearly 40 years, this family-owned business has made high-quality doors and wood components for kitchen cabinets. They provide over 950 quality jobs in my district. The owners have provided good health insurance that comports with their Mennonite beliefs for their employees, but now they are being coerced into providing government-approved health care, required to pay for products that include abortion-inducing drugs and sterilization. Anthony Hahn, President and CEO of Conestoga Wood Specialties Corporation, said this, quote, "Being told that we must provide a health plan that includes a provision that violates the Christian beliefs of our family and the Christian values of our company was founded on is deeply troubling. Forcing Americans to surrender long-standing, deeply held principles in order to own and run a business is not merely troubling, but unnecessary and unconstitutional, end quote. And they've gone to court over this. Americans should not have to sacrifice their religious rights when they enter the marketplace. Obamacare would fine Conestoga Wood Specialties up to $36,500 per employee per year, $34 million a year for not providing government-approved insurance, but only about $2 million for not providing any insurance at all. This is madness. Clearly, this law is out of control. Conestoga and many others are fighting for their rights in court, but here in Congress, we too have an obligation to defend the Constitution. The Founding Fathers established a Bill of Rights because they knew that the government would always be tempted to abuse its power. Democratic elections do not protect the rights of unpopular minorities. In fact, all too often, an unbound democracy becomes tyranny, the tyranny of the majority. The bureaucrats at the HHS may feel that they know what is best for all Americans, but being an American means the freedom to decide on your own, to let your convictions guide your life. What kind of nation will we be when the IRS decides who gets to assemble, when the Department of Justice decides who reports the news, and when HHS decides what religious beliefs are worthy of First Amendment protection? I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a Mennonite. We don't share the same ideas about what is morally objectionable on everything, but I do not believe that my ideals should be forced on them. Under Obamacare, we can't choose our doctor, we can't choose our health insurance plan. Now we lose our First Amendment rights. At one time, Pennsylvania was perhaps the only place in the world where people could freely practice their religious beliefs without fear of persecution. In a world where people were killing each other over theology, William Penn established a safe harbor in our colony. And Penn's once radical idea became the foundation for our nation's concept of religious freedom. The actions of the HHS remind us that our rights are not guaranteed. We must stand up and protect them. We must continually demand that the government respect that which has been granted to us by God. And I'm proud to stand with my colleagues tonight in defense of religious freedom, to stand with my constituents at Conestoga Wood Specialties. We should pass the Health Care Conscience Rights Act and make it clear that this House of Representatives will not stand by while minority religious beliefs are under attack. What a sad day for America when our fundamental rights, like religious freedom, freedom of conscience, are under attack by the heavy hand of government. We must pass this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Pitts, for your forceful words and your leadership. We're very, very grateful. I'd now like to call upon my good friend, Dr. John Fleming from Louisiana, and as a dedicated physician who cares deeply about the health care system in our country, I know you can provide us with extraordinary insights onto the problems with the implementation of the new health care law, but I think it's important to point out that you are one of the lead co-sponsors and a co-author of the Health Care Conscience Rights Act, and we're very grateful for your leadership as well. Dr. Fleming.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Fortenberry, gentleman from Nebraska, for bringing us together this evening and with a number of colleagues here talking about an extremely important topic today, and that is health care conscience rights. And you've heard some of the major points here, and I'm going to touch on more. On August 1st, 2013, the administration's coercive health care mandate will take effect. It will force religious organizations, American family businesses, universities, and countless others across the great country of ours to violate the deeply held moral and religious beliefs that we have. The HHS mandate is a serious affront to religious freedom and leaves American businesses, nonprofit religious organizations, and individuals with three terrible decisions. First, they could violate their conscience and religious convictions and comply with the mandate, purchasing and providing items and services they find morally objectionable. Second, They could resist the mandate, not complying with the federal regulations, and face fines up to $100 per employee per day. Or third, they could drop employee health coverage altogether, which defeats the purpose, the basic idea of Obamacare to begin with, leaving employees to fend for themselves and still pay a federal fine of $2,000 per employee per year, according to the business that employs that person. These are not actually choices, but a top-down, burdensome federal regulatory scheme that forces the American public to participate in a government-run health care plan that violates their values. Who are we talking about? Who will be affected by the HHS mandate? Mr. Speaker, to date, 61 cases and over 200 plaintiffs have filed suit against the federal government to preserve their First Amendment right of freedom of religion. One of the nonprofit lawsuits was filed by Louisiana College, a private Baptist college in Pineville, Louisiana, just outside of my district, offering degrees in art, music, science, nursing, social work, and teaching. This Central Louisiana school has over 70 programs of study, has a student enrollment of about 1,500 students, and a faculty-to-student ratio of 13:1. The HHS mandate requires that the Louisiana College provides employee health insurance covering abortion-inducing drugs and counseling on the use of such drugs. This, Mr. Speaker, is a violation of Louisiana College's belief that all life is sacred, including the life of the unborn. Who else? Hobby Lobby, another example of a well-known business throughout the country. We have 11 stores in Louisiana, employing more than 22,000 people in 41 states. The business practice of Hobby Lobby mirrors their religious principles. Their hours of operation are family-friendly, and they are closed on Sundays. Employee pay is important. Well, what is the antidote to this problem created by Obamacare and the rules rolled out of this administration? And I'm just going to quickly touch on them and then yield back to my good friend from Nebraska. Section 3 provides much-needed protections to ensure that the federal government cannot force individuals, charities, and businesses to buy plans for their employees that provide or facilitate coverage of items or services to which they have a deeply held moral or religious objection. Section 4 provides much-needed protections to ensure that any government agency that receives federal funds cannot force pro-life health care entities to be complicit in abortion or discriminate against them because they are pro-life. Section 5, which is Conscience Rights Act, amending Title II of Public Health Service Act, includes a private right of action for victims who have been discriminated against. You see, at this time, Mr. Speaker, people who are discriminated against or coerced or forced in some way by this mandate don't have access to courts. And so this opens up a private right of action that we can have, those of us who may object through our conscience will have our day in court. So just in conclusion, I would like to say, Mr. Speaker, that Obamacare has provided many, many problems and really no solutions. But there are even unintended consequences, and that is forcing people of conscience to have to make that decision on whether to end providing certain care for their employees or for their, really to their patients, or suffer large fines or just give up on health care coverage at all for their employees. I think it's time that this country comes together and decides, let's make health care attractive and affordable and protect life and protect those who want to protect life, and not have this top-down bureaucratic coercive system that's now in law that will require many of us to do many things against our conscience. That is simply un-American. With that, I yield and thank the gentleman for his time today.
Dr. Fleming, thank you as well for your leadership. To know that you left, gave up a medical practice to enter into public service and stand here today defending this deep, essential American principle, the rights of conscience, and as it affects those who are most vulnerable in our society, is frankly deeply moving to me, and I'm grateful for your leadership. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'd now like to call upon my good friend Congressman Chris Smith from New Jersey, and if you don't mind me calling you the Dean of the tireless efforts on behalf of so many of us to fight for human rights and the poor and the marginalized around the world. Your tireless efforts have been an extraordinary example to me, and I'm very, very grateful not only for your mentorship, but for your friendship. Congressman Smith.
Mr. Fortenberry, thank you for your extraordinary leadership. This has been a very tough fight, and you have been walking point and doing it with great class and with great precision. And I think your opening comments for this special order, which you have sponsored, just summed up the issue so eloquently. So I want to thank you for your leadership. It is making a difference. And while we may not have success on the short term, I do believe on the intermediate and long term we will prevail over time. And I thank you for your leadership, Mr. Fortenberry. You know, Mr. Speaker, President Obama today is using the coercive power of the state to force tens of millions of people of faith and people of conscience to violate a fundamental conviction or suffer a severe penalty. What Mr. Obama has done is unconscionable, unprecedented, and violates religious freedom. By coercing all insurance plans, including those offered by faith-based institutions, to pay for drugs and devices that are contrary to their deeply held beliefs, including subsidizing abortion drugs like Ella and Plan B, President Obama demonstrates a reckless disregard for conscience rights. Everyone must comply, regardless of moral convictions or religious tenets, simply because his administration says so. Mr. Obama's means of coercing compliance, absolutely ruinous fines of $100 per day per employee that total up to over $36,000 per year per employee. Just people listening at home, our members who may be listening to today's important special order, $36,500 per employee per year. When faith-based organizations refuse to comply, Obama's mandate will impose incalculable harm on millions of children educated in faith-based schools, as well as on the poor, the sick, the disabled, and frail elderly who are served with such compassion and dignity by faith-based entities. Even Notre Dame, which heaped praise and honors and an honorary degree on President Obama in 2009, will be crushed by this cruel mandate. Astonishingly, it was President Obama in his 2009 speech at Notre Dame University who said, quote, "Let's honor the conscience of those who disagree with abortion and draft a sensible conscience clause." Mr. Speaker, another promise broken, more empty, misleading rhetoric from the President who has excelled at that. Mr. Speaker, facts of the matter is approximately 4,600 employees are covered under Notre Dame's self-insured health plan, which means that Notre Dame will face fines of over $100 million a year when they refuse to comply with the Obama mandate. If Mr. Obama's attack on conscience rights isn't reversed, faith-based employers will be discriminated against and fined, and employees who today benefit from health insurance plans provided by their faith-based employer will be dumped into government health exchanges. And even when they do that, the fines on faith-based organizations are also without precedent. If a faith-based entity scraps its own insurance coverage because of the Obama mandate, they are then fined $2,000 per employee. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Obama's attack on conscience rights fits a dangerous, emerging pattern. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops had a federal grant to assist human trafficking victims under a law that I wrote, known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, and did an absolutely superb job, according to all professional reviews, assisting trafficking victims in this country. In 2011, however, the USCCB, or the Catholic Conference of Catholic Bishops, was blatantly discriminated against and thrown out of the program simply because they would not refer for abortions. That was it, thrown out of the program. The Healthcare Conscience Rights Act reasserts and restores conscience rights, Mr. Speaker, by making absolutely clear that no one can be compelled to subsidize certain so-called services in private insurance plans contrary to their religious beliefs or moral convictions. Again, I want to thank Mr. Fortenberry. He had introduced the legislation in the last Congress, was the first individual in this House to come out of the blocks to recognize just how damaging the Barack Obama anti-conscience initiative really is. And we need to move on this. We need to protect those men and women of conscience, those of religious belief, who will not bow and will not go in the direction that this administration is demanding. I thank my friend and yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Smith, for your, excuse me, your very powerful words. I think before you leave, I should say this. We also value your leadership. For decades now, you've stood in this House well, even when it wasn't the most popular thing to do, as it isn't now, to talk about that which is right and just, that which is higher and good, to, in a sense, provoke the conscience of this very body to more meaningful engagement. So I want to thank you again for your strong leadership. Thank you. Let's turn now to my good friend, Dr. Bill Cassidy, another physician in the House of Representatives from Louisiana. Again, like I told Dr. John Fleming, I think it's important that everybody knows that you left a medical practice to enter into public service, and we're very, very grateful for the example you've provided in your leadership as well. And I know you have some broader concerns about the issue of conscience and religious freedom, so we look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Congressman Fortenberry. A couple of things. First, I associate myself with the remarks made by my colleagues. I think that there is a concern regarding our religious freedoms here in the United States. But for just a moment, I want to draw the attention of those watching and to the Speaker to an issue of Pastor Saeed Abedini. He is an American, originally from Iran, who is now incarcerated for 8 years, this is his sentence in Iran, for crimes, as they define it, that happened 13 years ago. And this is a question of religious freedom which involves an American citizen who happens now to be abroad. Pastor Abedini is 33 years old, was born in Iran, there converted from Islam to Christianity. Here, that would not be a big deal because we have religious freedom. Theoretically, so does Iran. In his early 20s, he helped start house churches. It was legal to do so. At some point, he moved to the United States and married his wife, who I gather is also originally her family from Iran. They have 2 children. They live in Idaho. He went back to Iran to work on a non-sectarian orphanage. He was arrested by the state police, incarcerated at first, they said, for activities disruptive to the state. Now they apparently are attributing it to his work in house churches in the, around the year 2000. But he has been incarcerated, imprisoned, and is tortured. He's been taken to the hospital a couple of occasions. The physician recommended that he be admitted to a hospital. The Iranian government will not allow it. He's gone to seek medical care at another occasion. The nurse refused to touch him, saying that because he was a Christian or if he had been Baha'i, either, she would not touch him. So here we have a fellow, an American, who is being imprisoned for activities which happened 13 years ago in a country which is a signatory to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, in which someone may have religious freedom. Now, it is upon we as Americans, if you're a person of faith, to pray for the Abedini family. If you're a person not necessarily of faith but just believe in human rights, this is something which should be incredibly important to you. If you're just a person who has compassion for a 33-year-old man whose wife and 2 children are here alone, as he is being imprisoned and tortured for no other crime than attempting to start an orphanage for children who might not have another option, even that would offend someone who is of no faith whatsoever. So what can we as Americans do? One, we have to draw attention to it. We have a resolution that has been submitted that calls upon the U.S. State Department to intervene on his behalf. And in fairness, the State Department has attempted to do so in the past, but there is some feeling they could do more. And for the Iranian government to free him. So, one, we have this resolution before the members of Congress. If you're watching this, ask your member of Congress to sign on to this resolution. It has bipartisan support now. Number two, contact our State Department and ask them to redouble their efforts to free Pastor Abedini. And number three, include he and his family in your prayers. We can only imagine if our loved one was abroad, in prison, being tortured, without access to health care, and what that would mean for both wife, children, but also parents. And then lastly, join us all in admiration for a man in his commitment to the people whom he loves, was willing to risk something that he knew might be a possibility as he was living out his faith, caring for those, treating those as he would have them treat him, but as an impulse of his faith, going to those who were otherwise without care. So thank you for allowing me to speak on behalf of Pastor Abedini, and I thank you for having this discussion of religious freedom here tonight, and I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Cassidy, for your powerful words. As well as you were speaking, I was reminded of the fact that, you know, this is America. We disagree with what the President and the Secretary of Health and Human Services have done with health care, particularly imposing this harsh mandate. We need the right type of health care reform, but one that is going to protect our liberties and not simply shift on more unsustainable costs and spending to the government. Those are the normal debates that we have, but we have that debate.
Yes.
And we can have it right here without fear of that type of retribution that so many people in other places who are exercising their deep